Good morning, and welcome back to our virtual National Cities Conference, Uncharted Urban Futures, Australian Cities Post-Pandemic. My name is Dr. Gina Zappia. I'm the Research Program Manager at Currie, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to facilitate some of these important conversations today. I hope everyone had an enjoyable short break and are looking forward to this next session. Before we launch into this session, may I take this opportunity to again thank our two major sponsors, Infrastructure Australia and the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Now it is time to move to our first panel session, Population Mobility After the COVID-19 Crisis. A quick reminder, you can select either of the tabs on the right-hand side of your screen to ask a question via live Q&A or take part in a live discussion forum with fellow delegates. And to our session. Population has been a big topic during the pandemic, with international migration on hold for the last 18 months and significant changes to inter- and intrastate migration during this period. Governments at all levels are assessing the challenges of this pause in population growth, and there are many questions to unpack, which we're looking forward to doing with our excellent panel this morning. The session will begin with a presentation from Damien White, First Assistant Secretary, Commonwealth State and Population Division, the Treasury. We will then hear from our panellists. Welcome to Julian Lyngcoln, Deputy Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Dyan Currie, Chief Planner at Brisbane City Council. Please feel free to read more in-depth biographies on all our speakers today at the conference website. And with that, I would like to welcome Damien White to present.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks everyone at the conference. Thanks, Currie, for inviting us to come along. Like Romilly before us, I'm here in Canberra in Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and would just like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. One of my roles as First Assistant Secretary of Commonwealth State and Population Division is being the Executive Director of the Centre for Population in Treasury. It's a job I only took on 2 or 3 months ago, I think roughly at the beginning of the lockdown in Canberra. The centre itself was established in 2019 to be the Australian government's focal point for analysis of how Australia's population is evolving over time and how to better plan for it. Our main tasks are producing forecasts and projections of Australia's future population, including for the government's budget and intergenerational report, and to provide analysis and insights to support policy development from a population perspective. So mainly we're about numbers rather than policy, but our work goes into all sorts of policy discussions at the Commonwealth level and its states and territories as well. As was mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a big impact on our population and our ways of life. And some of those impacts are likely to be felt well into the future, not just the ones that we've already seen. I'm going to have a number of slides that basically discuss the data that illustrates what those impacts on population have been, and talk a little bit about the issues that we're keeping watch on to see what happens next. The immediate impacts of COVID have included restrictions on overseas migrants arriving in Australia, and I'll start there for a little bit. But the main focus will be on what we're seeing domestically, the changes to where people are choosing to move to and from around our country, particularly between capital cities and regions. If we can go 2 slides on, I think, please. Yeah, this one, okay. One of the main impacts of COVID-19 is that our population, while still growing, will be smaller and older than previously projected. The drop in net overseas migration from our closed international borders is the main cause. Overseas migration contributed around 60% of Australia's population growth in the last decade, but it's currently negative, as you can see by the blue bars dipping below the zero line in the middle of the chart. In addition, the overseas migration, reduction in overseas migration is expected to contribute to faster aging of our population. This is because migrants generally help offset population aging, as they are on average younger than the existing Australian population. In our projections, we think that the median age of the population will be 40 in 2031. This is about a year older than what we estimated pre-COVID. To put this in perspective, the median age increased by 2 years in the 2 decades between 1999 and 2019. So a 1-year increase in average age is pretty significant. And while our population growth is declining in the short term, we expect it will recover in the medium term as international borders reopen and migration resumes. Next, please. The short-term pause in overseas migration will likely have uneven impacts across Australia. Overseas migration has been the major driver of population growth in capital cities. They typically rely on overseas migrants for a large proportion of their growth. We particularly see this in inner and middle ring suburbs. The right-hand side chart on here shows that without overseas migrants, in 2018-19, those inner and middle rings of cities would basically have had no population growth at all. These are areas that traditionally attract international students, migrants seeking proximity to a wide range of work opportunities, and the location of many existing migrant communities that they join. We think that Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide will probably be the most affected cities in this way. In contrast, outer ring suburbs and regional areas are much less reliant on international migration. They will still take a hit from the pause in migrants, but their populations are more driven by internal migration and natural increase. In capital cities, slower population growth in high migration areas could reduce demand for infrastructure and change requirements of planning and delivery of services. In areas that depend heavily on migrant workers, low overseas migration could contribute to localised labour shortages. And this could be particularly in regional areas where accessing labour from other areas nearby may be more difficult. Next, please. Now we'll talk more about domestic movements. So internal migration, or people moving around Australia, is a key driver of population changes at the subnational level. The ABS's Provisional Regional Internal Migration Estimates, known as PRIME, which was funded by the Centre for Population, have given us more timely insights into the impact of COVID on internal migration. Initially, when COVID first hit, this resulted in less people moving within Australia because of the health situation, border closures, and economic uncertainty. In the year to December 2020, Prime showed that there was an 11% drop in interstate migration. 42,000 less people moved interstate compared to the previous year. However, we've then started to see a recovery in the number of people moving interstate. The most recent Prime data shows that there was the highest number of interstate moves in a March quarter since 1996, with 104,000 people moving. And this coincided with an easing in restrictions and minimal lockdowns in Australia. But as we know, we've had some other lockdowns happen since that March quarter. Next slide, please. The data also shows there has been an impact on the patterns of internal migration, not just the volume. This is where people are moving to and from around Australia. During the Australia-wide lockdown at the start of 2020, arrivals to regions, which is the darkish line at the top of this slide, and departures from regions to cities, which is the lighter lower line, both fell. This mirrored the previous chart showing there were less total moves. Regional areas, everywhere outside of greater capital cities, have had their highest net internal migration gains on record. That is shown by the green bars at the bottom of the screen. Initially, these record gains were driven by people staying in regional areas and choosing not to move to capital cities during the pandemic. That is, that lower lighter line fell at a steeper rate than the upper darker line. And that lower line has turned up slightly, but it's still well below its pre-pandemic peak. Then more recently, so during the March quarter, there was an uptick in capital city departures to regions. The number of capital city residents moving to regions is now slightly above what it was prior to the pandemic. It'd be hard to characterize this movement from cities to regions as an exodus, but it has picked up a little bit. And we do notice that migration from cities to regional areas was increasing even before the pandemic. From about 2016, you can see the numbers had been growing reasonably. Our expectation when we were doing numbers late last year was that almost all states would see a short-term shift of migration towards regional areas due to COVID-19 during the 2021 financial year. The first 3 quarters of prime data for that year have confirmed this. Next slide, please. But we need to understand what is driving that aggregate picture. Not all areas of Australia have been affected by COVID in the same way. The trends that I described in the prime data have been driven really strongly by the 112-day Melbourne lockdown between July and November last year. Melbourne has had by far the biggest change in internal migration. You can see the light blue line in that left-hand side chart that goes from about 0 right down for Melbourne. Regional areas in eastern states on the right-hand side panel, sort of at the top, have all had gains in internal migration. The rest of the cities and regional areas around Australia have had smallish movements, but they're very small in comparison to Melbourne and those eastern state regions. Next slide, please. So we'll have a little bit of a look about what happened in Melbourne last year and at the beginning of this year. Melbourne experienced a net loss of 32,000 residents in the 12 months to March 2021. That is more than 10 times the loss of 2,600 residents in the previous year. Initially, this was driven by a large drop in arrivals to Melbourne, but then after the end of the lockdown late last year, there was a record number of departures from Melbourne. In the year to March earlier this year, Melbourne had 16,000 fewer arrivals and 13,000 additional departures compared to the previous year. Regional Victoria was the destination of 43% of those extra people leaving Melbourne, with the other 57% moving interstate. Next slide, please. And we can see on these charts some of the impacts of that shock to Victoria's internal migration in other jurisdictions. It's been particularly stark in smaller states that usually lose people to Victoria, so including WA, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. You can see in the panels for those states particularly steep declines in the departures lines, which are green. Due to those drops in departures, net internal migration has been positive in South Australia for the first time since 1992, and in Western Australia for the first time since 2013. Impacts in other states, particularly the larger ones like New South Wales and Queensland, have been more muted in the official statistics so far. Next slide, please. So lastly, we'll just talk about some of the issues that we're keeping watch on when we look at what's happened in the population so far and our future forecasts. As I said, the pandemic's had a big change in the way people go about their lives, some of which might be temporary and some of which will be potentially longer term. And what we've seen is that some of those changes cause pressures. Some places have had way more people than they expected, and others have had quite a few less. And we've seen that some of these changes are quite hard to adjust to in the short term. So if we think about the challenges like lack of city workers in CBDs that affect hospitality and retail in those CBDs, or we've seen some regional areas where employment opportunities have increased, and there are issues like housing and those sorts of things which are making it hard for people to move there. So we have these four things on this slide that we're looking at. So we have economic and market uncertainty and lockdowns. People are generally less likely to move when there's high levels of uncertainty. They're more likely to go when they know they can secure a new job and somewhere to live in their desired location. So economic recovery and domestic restrictions on movements are likely to continue to be a factor in people's decisions to move. And so we'll be looking to see what impacts the recent lockdowns in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT had on internal migration, and how the economic recovery goes as we loosen up those restrictions and loosen up border closures internally. Some speakers already mentioned this morning working from home, and that ability has been a key part of the pandemic. So we saw a huge drift of people towards working from home early last year during lockdowns, and we've seen it again during the lockdowns this year. ABS data showed that prior to COVID, about a quarter of people reported working from home at least one day more per week. This has increased to 41% of people reporting working from home one or more days a week in February this year. If workplaces continue to offer that sort of flexibility, this could give people the opportunity to live in a more lifestyle-driven or affordable location. And that will have impacts on the areas where they used to live or what used to work, as well as those of where they are working now. Restrictions on international borders, we noted earlier the impacts predominantly affected cities. When we were doing projections at the end of last year, we projected the total population of capital cities to be about 5% smaller by 2031 than it would have been in the absence of the pandemic. Other areas will have only been around 2% smaller. So this relative slowing of growth in cities might influence things like labour markets, housing market conditions, both in cities and in regions, and that might influence people's decisions to move or not, as the case may be. And lastly, we're keeping an eye on young adults. They're the most mobile segment of our population. They often move for things like education or employment opportunities. And as a result, the impact of COVID on young people and their opportunity will be an important future internal migration issue, and will be an impact on the patterns. And we'll see that as evidence becomes available. So in summary, the pause in overseas migration made our population smaller and older, and will have a major impact on capital cities. We expect that to bounce back, but not make up for the gap that was experienced over the last 18 to 24 months. Internal migration has largely been a story of retention in regions until earlier this year, and we'll be watching to see what happens after the lockdowns later in this year, and whether things like economic uncertainty reducing and possibly the border closures becoming a receding issue, what they will have in the longer term. And whether the trend of people moving from capital cities to regions is an enduring one. So those are all the things that we've been looking at, and we're cautious about making future predictions. The pandemic's been a really large shock, and we don't profess to have all the answers to what we're about to see happening in the future, but it is our job to have a go, and you've seen some of those numbers on these slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Damien, for that insightful and beautifully explained presentation, very accessible. So now I'd like to welcome to the stage with me our two panel members, Julian Lyngcoln from the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Dyan Currie, Chief Planner at Brisbane City Council. We're now going to hear some opening remarks from both Julian and Di before we move into a panel discussion. We'll also be taking your questions. So please feel free to ask them at any time, and our team will work to curate the questions so that we can get to as many of them as possible. So firstly, I'd like to invite Julian to make some opening remarks on the topic.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks, Damien, for that great presentation. It's really great to be here talking on this very interesting topic. I'd like to also acknowledge country. The traditional owners of the lands from which I'm talking to you are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I'll give you a little bit of a Victorian state perspective. You'll hear lots of similarities in what I've got to say with some of the phenomena that Damien just spoke to. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the short term, what we think that means longer term, and some of the opportunities that might come out of that for us. And as Damien outlined, obviously there's a bit of speculation in that as to which of the changes we're seeing are just short-term ones that might snap back to something like normal post-pandemic, and which things will be longer-term trends. So we'll be watching that with interest. But probably the key point I would leave you with is our longer term strategies for population growth. So strategies like Plan Melbourne, which has got a 30-year outlook, we still think are very valid. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit as to why they might be more relevant than ever. So in the short term, though, it is a big change for Victoria. Pre-pandemic, we were seeing record population growth, the fastest in the nation. So it's been a big turnaround to see population loss for the first time for us since the 1990s. We lost around 43,000 people over the 12 months to March 2021. So that was compared to growth of around 120,000 in the previous year. So a pretty big change. And that the main driver of that change is, as Damien outlined, really due to overseas migration. So both in terms of borders being closed and people not coming into the country and down to Victoria, but also international students that might return home, temporary migrants that have returned home, contributing to that shift as well. So we saw net overseas migration change from a gain of 76,000 pre-pandemic to a loss of about 54,000 over a similar period. So a pretty big contribution overall to the population decrease. Similar to what Damien said, that's been most felt in the central city and inner suburbs. Certainly our international students tend to be concentrated there, but also other overseas migrants tend to be attracted to those sorts of areas as well. So we have seen a loss of activity around our CBD and inner city as a result, and there's lots of government initiatives now around bringing back activity in those sorts of areas. It's not a universal story. So even though we've had that population decrease, we have seen really strong growth in our regional areas. So as people have taken up the opportunities of remote working and regional lifestyles, we have seen a big shift to our regions. And so we did see migration from Melbourne to Victoria's regions, averaging a net of about 11,000 a year for the 5 years pre-pandemic, and the last year we saw a net gain of 20,000, so almost a doubling. Movement of people from Melbourne to our regions is not unusual. The difference in the last year or so has been not having the people come back the other way. So people moving from regions to Melbourne, we'd normally see. We're not seeing that sort of offset of the movement in the other direction. Probably just the other interesting thing is, despite all of the impacts of population change and that decrease, we're still seeing a lot of activity in our housing market. So there were 63,000 dwellings approved in Victoria in 2020, which is only slightly below the 5-year average from 2015 to 2020 of 65,000 an annum. And our growth areas are still going gangbusters. So we had almost 23,000 dwellings approved in our growth area, local government areas in 2020, which was the largest number we've had. So that was a record number for us. So it's kind of interesting to see that even though we've had that short-term population decline, we've still got lots of demand for housing that we're seeing. Not necessarily the case in the inner city apartment market and things like that, but certainly our growth areas still growing strongly, and that demand I talked about in our regions. So just perhaps finally, what does all of that mean in terms of opportunity? I think, as I said, our Plan Melbourne strategy, we think, remains valid, and some of those concepts in the strategy around a polycentric city, the need to accommodate growth in established areas, concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods, we've certainly found through the pandemic people have discovered the importance of what's on their doorstep or in their 5K bubble. Projects like the suburban rail loop that are focused not just on transporting people into the central city for jobs, but being able to move around the city, and then the the opportunities around regional growth, but also a little bit of a breather from population growth for infrastructure to catch up. And we've got a huge program of infrastructure in the state, as is the case right across the eastern seaboard. And also we're looking at reform opportunities. So how do we streamline our planning system to help aid economic recovery and cater for those sort of shifts in demographic change that we're seeing. So I might leave it there in terms of a bit of an overview, and look forward to any questions that might come as well.
Thank you, Julian. So a mix of challenges, but also many opportunities you're talking about, which we'll discuss more in our panel discussion. So I'd now like to invite Di to make some opening remarks. Thank you, Di.
Thanks so much, Gina. Thank you, Damien, for such a well-articulated overview of the situation across the country. And I, of course, will be experiencing and sharing with you a very different situation to that Julian has just been able to share. Because, of course, throughout the last 18 months, the rest of the country has woken up to the joys of living in Brisbane and southeast Queensland. And it appears many have chosen to head up to Queensland. So we're experiencing quite staggering growth levels, and certainly a lot of energy in the business environment and the development environment. So there's certainly been some very clear changes as a result largely of COVID. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but of course, the recent announcement of the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, which will fuel, we suspect, an ongoing continuation of this particular pattern of growth we've seen. The sorts of changes that we've been experiencing in Brisbane in particular, but certainly SEQ and into regional Queensland, has been clear interstate migration, very clear changes, of course, as we've seen across the country in terms of the patterns of working from home or working remotely, as I'm trying to change all of our language too, because I think it also reflects a number of different working environments. We've seen distinct changes in people's connections to their suburbs, to their neighbourhoods, and what that's done from a transport implication, but also certainly from suburban growth and spending ratios. And in particular, really distinct changes in terms of people's attachments to their green spaces, whether they're local parks, running tracks, walking tracks and bike paths, a very distinct change for us in terms of active transport options. We're also seeing really clear changes now in housing needs, in demands in terms of structures within detached housing, but also the size and construction typologies for apartments. And of course, like many, we've also seen changes in our city centre. So if I just start quickly with population growth, we've obviously seen the other end of the spectrum to what's happened in the southern parts of our country. We've had 30,000 people move to Queensland in internal migration in 2020. That's our highest net gain since 2014, with clear growth in people moving up from New South Wales and Victoria in particular. 13,000 of those moved into Brisbane alone. Our current forecasts expect that interstate migration to continue with another 62,000 new residents expected over the next 3 years. And that's, of course, before we've seen the returns to international migrations. There's been quite a lot of press over the last 12 months about the fact that Brisbane is the fastest growing capital in the country. But we've also seen quite substantial regional growth, in particular in our coastal areas, coastal cities such as Gladstone, even as far north as Gladstone and Hervey Bay, have been experiencing quite significant growth with housing price changes and any local subdivision capacity being very, very quickly picked up. What we've also seen is that as a result of the remote working trend, we've had major firms be able to relocate people up into Queensland, either partially or in full. So we're certainly seeing a change in the business community's understanding and relationship to Brisbane as a corporate headquarter. Certainly the commentators are all suggesting that these changes and their growth changes are as a result of COVID, house prices being cheaper in SEQ, and also the sheer livability of this part of the country. As a result, though, I'll note we are seeing some rapid growth in housing prices at the moment. But one of the other trends that I think is of particular interest for us to think about broadly is the loss of international students. We have up to 100,000 international students in our city at any one point in time normally. So that's having a very distinct impact from a housing perspective, but also on our universities. And I do think we might all need to think about what this change is going to mean to our universities over time, as many of the international students have.
A little bit of a technical glitch there with Dyan's connection. So while we rectify that, we might launch into questions, if that's okay with Damien and Julian. I'm sure that Di will join us. I just want to encourage our audience to utilise the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen to post any questions you might want me to then pose to Damien, Julian or Di. But I'm going to be very selfish and launch with one of my own after having taken some very interesting notes from all three of your discussions. Can we talk about green space and the importance of green space? Because certainly from a personal perspective, the 5 kilometre radius, I found every single corner of that and every single gum tree, magpie, cockatoo. So can we talk a little bit about that, about livability in our cities and how that's changed and how we need to focus on that?
I'm happy to kick off there if you like. So I mentioned within Plan Melbourne, we've got this sort of concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood, which is really about people being able to live locally, to have, within a walking distance, essentially, services and recreation and those sorts of things available to them. And I think your experience, Gina, for anyone living in a 5K bubble was pretty typical, that they discovered all sorts of things on their doorstep they didn't realise they had before, including that need for open space to get out, particularly in those sort of inner city areas, get a bit closer to nature. So I think there's been a renewed kind of understanding of the importance of that. We've certainly, as I said, got that 20-minute neighbourhood concept, and also the Victoria released an open space strategy recently as well, which really put an emphasis on that. So, and whether that be larger parks or smaller pocket parks and the like, I think people are looking to have that available to them within walking distance to get out and about and out of their home office into some fresh air and some greenery around them. And then, of course, there's the issues around canopy cover and urban heat island as well that can help contribute to dealing with as well.
And Dyan, I might actually mix across to you if I can to respond, because you also raised the importance of green space. Then perhaps if you'd like to tie off and finish your presentation, which you were talking about a loss of international students, I'd love to hear the end of your sharing.
I think that if I'll just start with the international students, but I think that conversation around our neighbourhoods is a critical point for us. For me, the question around international students, it could be temporary or it might not be. We've certainly seen trends of international students starting to register as an ongoing student in other countries. And I think that has implications for our universities and then for, both the structure of our cities, but also the structure of some of our future workforce. So I do think that is a COVID trend that is one that we all need to be considering. But if I do come back to that neighbourhood issue for a moment, we saw obviously people's attachment to being at home, to getting out and their green spaces. But I think the other really interesting aspect for us was the shift of spending across the city. We track spending by suburb and neighbourhood level as well. And what we saw was obviously a significant decrease in spending in the inner city, but the corresponding increase in spending across the suburbs. Small neighbourhood centres, which in the past had not necessarily been as strong, certainly became thriving and quite vibrant areas. And that's continued even as people have moved back into a return to work in the CBD. So I think if we consider, we've seen the Productivity Commission's report recently on the ongoing trend for working remotely, we're going to see this continuation of the importance of our suburban areas and our neighbourhood centres, as well as people's attachment to understanding the importance of their city centre, but in a different way. And I think that they're really interesting trends for us in terms of city thinking, shaping and building.
Absolutely. And so how will we attract, there was a comment earlier in, I think it was Julian, how will we attract people back into the city? We've now become so accustomed to living in a smaller space, a smaller area. How will we entice the populations back into those city centres?
I think, one of the tasks we've got now is to look at what, the role of the central city is and how that might change. And there'll be a range of factors in that. What does the future of work look like? Our commercial spaces in the city, do we see those being utilised less? There are, some big companies that have mothballed commercial space. Is that a short-term thing and we'll see workers come back in, or will we see that uptake of flexible remote working become a far bigger thing? And that might not be fully one or the other. What we're likely to see is a hybrid where people are still spending time in offices but less, and doing a mix of working from home and some time in the office to get both the benefits they've got of not having to deal with a commute and a bit more flexibility in their lives, but also some of the advantages of connection with people with some time in the office as well. So what does that mean in terms of our spaces in the city? What repurposing might there be? And if we're seeing a decline in activity in CBDs from that worker activity in the day, what are the other things that bring people in? So, the events, the cultural activities, so the city serves a slightly different purposes, and it has a greater emphasis on some of those other reasons that would bring people into cities rather than just relying on the activity of workers. And as Dyan said, international students, it'd be interesting to see the longer term trend around, do we see a return in the numbers we had before or not? Because there's no doubt that international students were adding a lot of activity around our central city as well.
We're about to release a revision of our city centre master plan, and its engagement activities and activation activities next week, actually. And it's that first stage for us. It was quite timely because our last city centre master plan had been in place for some time, and each of the key activities that had been forecast have now commenced construction. So pieces. So it was timely, and of course the announcement of the games, it's timely. And for us, it's partly thinking around those activation opportunities, but also really making sure that people celebrate those moments of coming together. We might have all learnt the joys and the opportunities that working remotely brings, but we've also learnt, I think, to celebrate the importance of those moments together. So I think it's going to be a case of how do we ensure that what we're building are office spaces and city spaces that really celebrate those opportunities and remind people and entice them back into those events and those cultural activities, as well as being at work together, whether that's 3 days a week or whatever it is that people settle into as that hybrid routine.
We were discussing earlier before we launched the session about the importance of collaboration and working human to human. This technology certainly supports and favours this type of interaction, but nothing can beat that working from the office and being there with your colleagues and being able to meet in person. Absolutely, there are those advantages as well. Damien, can I bring you into the conversation? Would you like to make some comments on either Julian or Dyan's presentations that we've heard this morning?
So I might just start quickly with students. So international students will be interesting in the next few months and seeing what happens for the first semester next year, and in international students who not only have to turn up for sort of the February, March beginning of uni, but who often come for English language tuition before that. So we won't have to wait very long before we see whether we get some bounce back quickly from those. With all the things around it about students needing to be double vaccinated and all those sorts of things that come with the new world that we live in. So that will be an interesting thing. And longer term, I think, as was mentioned, the question of whether they come back in the same numbers or not will be an interesting thing to watch. Certainly, some of our competitor English-speaking countries have been making a reasonable push at trying to get into that market a bit more, while our borders have been closed more than theirs. But those will be interesting things. And it's not just, it has a few aspects. So there's the question about the model that universities had about, attracting them and how they're going as businesses. As Dyan and Julian said, it's about some people who live in CBDs especially, but not just CBDs. They're spread a bit more around the country than that too. And we sort of have to remember that they also participate in our workforce as well as those students a little bit as well. And so that impact of the closed international border on our workforce, I think every state and territory and probably almost every city and town across the country has some sort of workforce shortage thing that they're currently experiencing. So they'll be interesting things to watch as our international border opens up. A personal reflection on green spaces. Living in Canberra during a lockdown, I think, has been a very fortunate event, as I don't think the founders of Canberra had a pandemic in mind when they had so many green spaces. But it has been quite striking, and we didn't have a 5-kilometre bubble or anything, but it's been quite striking how many people have been out in green spaces, and given even how many we have. Things around like the Arboretum that's only about a decade or two old. You drive past there on weekends when we're locked down. It was like, how are people social distancing out here in this green space? It's like, so that I think that is a big thing that has been noticed a lot about when you can't move about as much as you like. The importance of those spaces close to where you live has been something that's, been easy to be noticed in a city like living in Canberra.
I think we've all experienced different degrees of that, certainly. And I hope that appreciation continues for those green spaces, the importance of them. And so, Dyan, you talked at the end about your loss of international students, and we touched on, I noted in Damien, your slides about labour disruptions and uncertainty. And we've found in Melbourne recently a huge shortage around hospitality industry. Mm. That sector is suffering greatly with staff. Can we, as a group, talk about the challenges there?
Oh, look, I'd certainly add that's been a significant issue for us, even despite the levels of interstate migration we've had. The hospitality sector has certainly suffered. We know that that's partially our students, but it's certainly been a significant issue for us generally. Even through to the qualified positions of chefs, we've seen a really interesting impact on that, and we know that that's our international workers not being able to be here. So even though many of our hospitality businesses were able to trade earlier and for longer than perhaps the southern states were able to, we've had significant difficulty in terms of recruitment of staff. We're waiting for the international borders like you all are.
Absolutely.
I would just add, I think there's two aspects to this. I think we've seen a generalised labour shortage. Yes. Of just people finding it hard to get people. And then there's separately but linked a skill shortage of various jobs as well. So, it is true, I think, in things like possibly like hospitality and those places where you don't need too much training and stuff to get up to speed. It's been more like a labour shortage, and that has been a lot of international people. But then there is things like possibly like in IT sectors, accounting, those sorts of things we've seen where, there are more skilled migrants who come in who've been doing a lot of those jobs who are missing. And, when we have discussions around the table with all our state and territory Treasury colleagues at the moment, it is the one thing that they all talk about. Mm. And they all have slightly different areas or sectors where it's biting, but it's the one constant of like, we just need more people. And it's the international border, and for some states that still don't have open their interstate borders, that's having an effect as well on some of that movement around the country that can mitigate some of those things.
Gina, do you mind if I just ask Damien a follow-up question on that topic?
Please.
I'm really, one of the things that's sort of really turning my mind at the moment, and I say this as the lead for the Brisbane City Council as host city for the Games, the attraction, the international awareness and investment interest in Brisbane and Australia as a result of the Olympic Games announcement has quite staggered me. I didn't really know and understand that. until the days and weeks and months since the announcement has been made. I'm not sure if you guys might all be much more acquainted with these things than I was prior to the Games, but it's about half of the world's population that watch the announcement of the next Olympic Games hosts. And the immediate impact that had in terms of investment inquiry into our city was just mind-blowing. People ringing and saying they'd never considered that potentially Australia would be the location for their next major event, major business investment decision, but we're now thinking about it in a different way, and certainly thinking about Brisbane as a global city now. It's an interesting opportunity for us, because with that scale of international investment opportunity will also come the people who are then keen to move here from a jobs perspective. So I think we're going to be in for a particularly interesting time as we move out of the COVID closures and think about, not just returning to what we were, but also what that's going to mean with the 10-year legacy opportunity that we've got before the Games and the international attention that will come to us automatically.
Yes.
There's some changes there in certainly what we were forecasting that I've had to rethink things on the basis of the last 3 months without question.
Yeah.
All very good, all very exciting, but I think it will have interesting legacy impacts for us as a country, as well as us as a city and region.
It's incredibly insightful, Di. That's and I just wonder, what are these opportunities that we can take up now during this slower period for this it feels like a preparation.
Well, that's there's some of the things that are certainly turning my mind. What are the opportunities for investment and for growing the Australian economy, particularly in terms of interesting areas, whether it's med technology, sports technology, which only recently I learnt is now 1% of the world's GDP. There are opportunities here as a nation that loves its sport that I think really give us an opportunity to think about where might we need to be investing in terms of future growth and future economic potential for us as a country, certainly for us as a city and as a region. I think it would be remiss of us to not take this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and run with it.
And Julian, would you like to speak into that topic as well? We haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah, I think, I agree with that point Di's making, that, there's obviously some things that we've relied on heavily that have taken a hit in the short term. So we should be looking at what our other relative strengths are that we can play to. When I gave my outline at the start, there's obviously challenge in a lot of this, but there is opportunity as well. I think there's big opportunity for our suburbs, and people have spoken to the kind of the discovery almost of the suburbs, not just in terms of people living and working from their houses, but the economic opportunity for businesses there as well. And then in our regions, so we've seen that strong demand into our regions, and not just in the traditional locations of our big regional cities, but the coastal areas, and Di talked to that happening in Queensland as well. It's kind of hard. Some of that's unexpected and sudden, and so some of those areas are not as well prepared for that. So there's a really short-term challenge to help those regional areas do some strategic planning, work out the best place for some housing supply, and to get on with doing that. So there'll be a fair bit of state assistance going into helping them do that. But it's great that people are seeing the benefits of regional lifestyle if they're able to work from those locations. It takes it's not going to solve the population growth challenges of the big cities, but it certainly can take the pressure off a little bit, and it can create a lot of economic opportunity in those regional areas.
I'm just going to draw in a question from our audience through the Q&A. And for you, Julian, was exactly that. Is DEWLP proposing to provide greater assistance for regional councils for the VPA in planning for the unexpected regional growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was saying, because some of that's unexpected, some of those local government areas haven't necessarily done the strategic planning to be ready for some of these demands coming on them, and the capacity of some of the regional councils to do that is, it varies quite a bit. The big regional councils have been doing that sort of planning for a while, and a place like Geelong has been growing as fast as any suburb of Melbourne for a while, but some of those smaller councils don't necessarily have the planning capacity. So there will be, or there is, assistance going into that between the Victorian Planning Authority, which has got a Streamlining for Growth program to help unlock those growth opportunities for councils, but also we've been funded for a whole lot of planning reform, but that's included what's called regional hubs, which is really the state being able to help out some of those councils with some of those strategic planning exercises to rapidly deal with what's coming at them. It is, as I noticed in the comments, having an impact on prices, so that demand without supply is putting prices up, both in terms of purchase of houses, but rents as well. So that is an issue in the short term. So there is that state assistance going into those councils to help them with that.
Thanks, Julian. Dyan, can you speak to that point around about the affordability issues and the challenges of that movement of people from the city centres to the regional areas, and how we've certainly seen in national but also state level it's been very challenging, particularly for renters?
Yeah, we've certainly seen a change in housing pricing generally, and I've certainly noticed that throughout the regions in my conversations with my other local government colleagues. I think the situation that we've seen, and potentially because we've been in a different position, has been the ramping up of supply as well. So I know in my council, we've gone through a year of record development approvals. We had already re-geared, our amazing development approvals team had re-geared to be able to speed up approvals, thinking that there could potentially be a slowdown. And in fact, it ramped the other way. So what we've been able to do, and I've seen this in some of our regional colleagues, is be able to get approvals out to enable that increase in supply to occur. One of the other changes that we have seen, though, is a very distinct change in what people are asking for in their homes. So even whether it's a detached house, where we've seen a complete change that now a separated office, fully constructed, is now part of basic housing demand moving forward. And it's no longer acceptable to have the sort of study nook. We've changed in what we do in our homes. But we've also seen that coming through in apartment sizes. We're seeing applications that have had previous approvals coming back into us with people wanting slightly larger apartments, and certainly that focus on wanting a usable size balcony, which is not surprising at all in terms of those changes. So I think we're seeing a structural rethink of what people want in their housing type, as well as the location. Equally, we've seen a distinct increase in interest in the inner ring, so where people can get into the city quickly to work for 2 to 3 days a week, as well as being able to be at home and enjoy their suburbs. So there's some change, I think, in terms of where those price points are and where the demand is as well. Excuse me.
I think it's one of those trends where there's so much uncertainty about whether it's going to be sustained or not. And no doubt centres like Damien will be watching that very carefully. That, I mean, the big regional centres, as I said, we're experiencing big growth anyway. So I think that will continue. But the push to the coast, how much of that is people living out of their holiday houses and the like at the moment that might return to Melbourne as things open up there? We don't know yet. We'll watch that one closely. Dyan was talking about watching spending patterns, and that was one of the early indicators we had about people moving, particularly to coastal areas, seeing credit card spends up in those sorts of areas even before we had the population numbers. So we'll be trying to watch that to see whether it's a one-off and the people that want to shift out there have sort of done it, or whether some people start to move back to the city as things open up, or whether there is in fact a longer-term trend with more remote working being possible for people to take up regional lifestyles and work city jobs.
It's too hard, isn't it, at the moment to predict in detail? There's this gut sense that I have and I'm a strong believer in evidence-based decision making, but there is this sense that people have had a rethink of what's important to them. And I don't know how we pick what that will mean just yet in terms of what that does for the actual changes on ground. Yes, we certainly know that some form of working remotely is likely to be embedded into systems here from here on, but it is hard to know what that will mean in terms of that regional growth. For me, I've always loved the opportunity of living in the regions. I've done that for many years. It's a great place to live. So I think people have seen that and are enjoying that now, and perhaps having a difference of thought process around what's really important to them. It's also great fun living in capital cities. So I don't think we're going to see people great losses in terms of capital growth, because they're always such a great, vibrant place to live. But it's a little too early to pick, which is our problem.
Absolutely. And on that note, Damien, we have an interesting question from one of our delegates. Outside the standard sources of data on population movements, are there any new or novel data sources or methods that can be used as proxy indicators to provide more up-to-date insights on population mobility?
So that's been I'll talk about this in general first before I get to population. So the pandemic has led to lots of innovation in data sources. By lots of people. So the Bureau of Statistics have found a bunch of ways to try and measure things much more quickly than they would normally put things out. A lot of that has been relying on people like banks who have a lot of real-time data about what's going on. And I think we've all sort of relaxed our level of evidence we want about how good the data is before we put it out. So it's been much more important to have data and know that it might be a bit wrong, but mostly right, than it has been ever before, because by the time you got the real data, it's like moved on and the world could be completely different. So it's been a really interesting time for innovation. The prime data I talked about was one of those things, right? That prime data was coming out several months in advance of the normal interstate migration data. It was based on people's Medicare address changes and those sorts of things. It was going along really great until March. But the fact that it was going along at the same time as people were getting vaccinated, and when people got vaccinated, they also changed their Medicare addresses in ways that didn't happen before. And so it had a massive catch up in where people actually live in the Medicare database, meant that for the June quarter, that data hasn't been put out and won't be put out probably, because it doesn't really reflect what people moved. It reflects that they went and got a vaccination and got asked where they lived. So that's sort of an unfortunate, but there is some other data going around. So if I just look here for a second on my other computer that I've got next to me, there's some Commonwealth Bank data as well, I think, that they're using about the change in addresses of their customers that has been put out by, I think it's the Regional Australia Institute. So that's out there as well, and it's got data more like up to about September, I think, which sort of shows some of those trends about people moving to the regions that I talked about in mine that only ended in March still holds up. And that would take into account some of the lockdowns and those sorts of things. So yeah, so there is innovation coming, and we're looking at those sorts of things. There's probably going to be a bit more, but I think I think it will be driven by, especially by businesses who have large sources of data that they have for doing their business, and us finding ways of reassuring them that we won't identify people and doing that de-identification processes that give them reassurance that it can be used. So I think all those things are happening, and it will be interesting to see whether they happen more as time goes by.
Damien, we were rolling out a city analytics unit before COVID, but it just happened that it happened to be in place in January last year, which turned out to be really useful for us. And that team, because of the sheer pace and change of the availability of new sources of data, have been just amazing. They developed their own version of, the product safety sheets that we get with everything that's got a chemical attached to it. They've developed their own version of those for data so that we know and understand what we used it for and what we thought it was suitable for from a metadata perspective at that point in time, and then where they've moved on just for that reason, because it's staggering at the moment to see just how much we're getting access to that we never used to even know existed, did it? And that's informing and leading us to make really, I think, much stronger decisions. But it's keeping track of how we use it and how we make sure people are comfortable with its use as well.
I think that's right. So one of the really the big things that in Treasury we're able to do is the ATO, for anybody who's a business person and understands this, has single touch payroll, which I think is where you put in people's wages and how much tax you pay the tax office. But it was amazingly valuable in things like the JobKeeper and what sort of assistance we want for people who are in businesses and what we think the business community is doing in ways that we would never have been able to do a few years ago. And that's just because, and that was a system that was built not even remotely for that reason. It was actually help people pay their tax more efficiently and stuff. But the data that comes out of it gave us a lot of information about whether we thought people would be okay or not as assistance for individuals came off and lockdowns ended and those sorts of things.
It's fascinating. It's about being nimble, isn't it, and responsive. And Guy, as you say, engaging with that data and recognising its efficacy. And it's certainly, I'm very passionate about ethics in research and always aligning our practices with those requirements. Absolutely. I'm just going to encourage again, if I may, our audience, our delegates, to utilise the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, because we'll continue to talk amongst ourselves as panel members, and I will draw in those questions, but don't be shy, pop your questions in there. Are there any comments that we'd like to close with? We've got a little bit of time before our session closes, but are there any thoughts that have come up for any one of our panel members through our discussions this morning?
I think that the big one for me is that we've just been talking to here is that there's just so much uncertainty at the moment. So we've seen these short-term impacts. We're speculating on what might happen longer term. We're scrambling to look at all sorts of weird and wonderful data sources we've never used before for these sorts of purposes to try and get a handle in the short term, and because the changes are happening so quickly as well. So and we saw this in Victoria when the first lot of restrictions eased. There was a lot of activity and economic activity that bounced back very quickly. Then we went to another lockdown. So things can shift very dramatically in the space of a couple of months. So trying to get a handle on what's actually happening out there, what it means when you're looking at the data is, because in this sort of space, we're used to looking at 5-year trends and ABS data that comes out on a certain frequency that tells us what happened in the year gone by, and we're now in a space of trying to work out month to month what's happening, and governments are trying to work out policy responses that they need to those things, to particularly trying to address some of the short-term impacts we're seeing on different parts of the state. So it's a pretty different environment for us. We'll all be doing a lot of comparing notes across the different levels of government, I think, to try and understand. We're engaging pretty heavily with private sector as well. Development sector, what are you seeing? What do you think it means? So it's leading to some good, I think, collaboration, to some innovation in understanding the data. And but yeah, there's plenty of uncertainty yet. We'll be very interested to see how things settle down over the next sort of 6 months to a year. And as Damien said, we might learn a lot in the next few months.
I think for me, as much as this has all been obviously an enormous shock to us as a country and as the world, it's also really changed our resilience and our agility. And I think that is really interesting for us moving forward. We've learned that we can do things in a pace that we never could before, and that our communities are okay with that. We've also learned, I think, massively different ways to be able to engage with large numbers of people quickly. And I think that's really important for us as we're considering the changing nature of cities moving forward. And I think we've also learned to share information and analysis of trends in a far more rapid rate than we've ever done before. I had the privilege of being invited in March last year to join the World Economic Forum's Future Cities group. They met, and Rob Adams is in that group from Melbourne. We met every week for most of last year, and every week somebody from somewhere around the world would share an observation of what they were seeing in their city or their particular sector. The ability to have that sort of quite live exchange of trends meant I could be watching what was going on and thinking about that and collecting the data behind that for our city and for our country at a pace that we've never been able to do. So I think we all have to remember to do that and also remember to share. But to be in sessions like this, where we're conscious of 3 levels of government working, talking with the private sector and acknowledging that things are moving differently, I'm not so sure we would all have been comfortable with doing that a few years ago. So, they're the benefits for me, and those moments that we have to stop and remember to say this is a change that we need to keep.
Absolutely. Just sustain those conversations and that openness and collaboration. That certainly does build resilience. Damien, did you want to speak into Guy's comment?
I would add a couple of things. So it's a really challenging time for people who spend their life forecasting stuff. A bit like Julian said, the movements have been so big and so sudden that they've sort of put us all out of our comfort zone a lot, because normally you forecast something and you sort of have a smallish change on what happened before, and that's not really the world we're living in. And so questions like how quickly population or international migration might bounce back, for example, it's like, well, so we're down here at less than 0 at the moment. Normally we'd want to take our time getting back to the 200,000 that were coming in, but actually in this world it could go back really quite quickly, and that feels really tricky for forecasting, right? And I think everyone in our department who forecasts anything, whether that's the population or the economy in general or things around the budget, are getting much more comfortable with maybe you can have big changes and you have to accept that you're probably going to be wrong by a lot. But you have to do those things. And that leads to the thing that was also mentioned about being nimble and those sort of things. All of our systems have rigidities in them that don't allow us to move hugely quickly, and some of them aren't able to be overcome as quickly as we'd like, but some of them we have found ways of doing things that are really quite quick. And the last thing I would add is that I think in the area where I work, we talk with the states about a lot of stuff. We have talked with the states far more often than we were before, partly because actually having a chat with someone has become far more valuable, as sort of the ability of data to keep up hasn't been there. So actually having those discussions about what we would have previously called anecdotal evidence and probably dismissed partly because of that has become much more valuable, right? Actually, what is going on? What are you seeing? How is it working? How can we work together to do things? That has been quite an amazing transformation, I think. Guy just talked about meeting weekly. So when the pandemic first hit, the treasurers were meeting each other twice weekly, which was quite a shock to us public servants who were used to them getting together formally twice a year. And so it slowed down a bit, but that interaction at both the public service level and the minister level has been ramped up quite a lot because of the reasons we've talked about.
So it's clearly evident that we can spring to action. And do you think and what is our I want to use the word hope, it feels a little bit juvenile, but what is our hope for the future? Do you think we will continue to keep those communication lines open?
I would think it's going to take at least some time to go back. I would think that we've learned a bunch from that, and anybody who's been through it has recognized the benefits of where we've gone and how it's working. And yeah, I can't see it going back for some time, including because I think we're going to be in a world of pretty uncertain times about what's happening. If you look around other parts of the world and sort of see that we clearly haven't got on top of coronavirus everywhere, that it keeps coming back, even if vaccines are protecting most people. I think we're going to be in this world of coronavirus uncertainty and the uncertainty about things like what happens for work, even if coronavirus isn't around for quite a while yet.
And there's also a period of economic recovery worldwide that we don't understand the implications of in any detail, and nor can we. So,
and I think also for those of us that work in bureaucracies, we've sort of discovered we can have these regular interactions without needing hundreds of pages of papers and briefings and everything pinned down in terms of all the evidence. That the urgency we've had has led to a bit more informality around some of that catching up, and that in many cases has not been a bad thing.
Yeah. I would also add that we've learned that we can communicate like this more instead of getting together too, right? Which makes getting together far easier than having to find one place for 8 or 9 jurisdictions to fly to. And
right.
Yes, we've become gracious in regard to the view of everyone's lounge rooms, our family pets, our children, and our tech difficulties. And I think on that note, I'll offer you another opportunity. If there's anyone, Di, Julian, Damien, any other comments you'd like to share with our audience today?
It might sound kitsch, but can I just pick up on that point, Gina? As much as you say we've become more gracious with these things, but I also think there's a connection in humanity here that has occurred as a result of all of this. And, part of that has been that we now see each other in a different way because there's a dog that wanders through. For me, it's always my cat's tail, which sort of makes it this scale across a screen whenever I'm on it. But I think that connection is important. The connection that we've made through these types of agility, those connections that we've made in our suburbs with people getting out for walks every afternoon, I think that's all part of this structural change that has occurred around the world. And I think it's going to be really interesting in terms of what does that mean for the future of cities, that special nature of places where people want to interact and the reinforced nature that is important to us, and the importance of that even in our offices. So I think there's a lot that's still emerging in that space around connection.
Well, on that beautiful note, Di, I thank you so much for those closing comments. I really want to thank you all so much for your time and your enthusiasm to share in this space. And please, audience members, join in thanking Damien White, Julian Lyngcoln, and Dyan Currie. And before we break for lunch, we have the first of our 2 international keynotes presenters. So I would like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Tom Alves, back to the stage, the main stage, to introduce this session. Hi, Tom. Great to see you, and I look forward to seeing you again later.
Thanks, Gina. Thank you. Look, hello again, everyone. It's my pleasure, as Gina said, to introduce our first of 2 international speakers at the conference today. From the United Kingdom Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and Cities, it's Professor Chris Rogers. Now, due to the time difference between Australia and the UK, it's actually 1 o'clock in the morning there right now, Chris very kindly agreed to record his presentation. And I also caught up with him to record a short Q&A session after his presentation as well. I won't say anything further about Chris because he introduces himself and the work that he's doing in the UK very well in his presentation. But we now welcome Chris Rogers. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris Rogers and I go by the title of Professor of Geotechnical Engineering. But that really only tells part of the story. So although I've done a lot of work in the urban subsurface, what I now do is consider cities and cities of the far future as the platform for my research portfolio. And I lead something called the National Buried Infrastructure Facility at the University of Birmingham, and it sits over my shoulder. But what I'm going to be talking to you today about is some work under what is called UCRIC, which is the UK Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and Cities. So I'm going to be talking on the topic of a global journey into uncharted urban futures. But in so doing, we have to lead to a more sustainable, more resilient, more livable set of places. And by using those terms, I would also throw in smart, but smart in my sense is related to those terms. And this slide shows the logos of some of the many projects that I've been associated with over the years and led, all funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in the UK. So I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who've worked on those projects with me. The UK Collaboratorium, very big word, and that word is deliberately chosen to be inclusive of all of the disciplines that need to come together to look at this issue of infrastructure in cities. So the UK Collaboratorium goes by the acronym UCRIC. And what we're looking to do is provide the transdisciplinary, systems-based research approaches to the transformation of infrastructure in urban systems, obviously for the better. Clearly, what we're looking to do is to enable safe, resilient, and sustainable living, and to looking at generating economic opportunities for the UK, because that's where we're based, but clearly it is a global challenge. So before I get on to that, what I want to ask you is what is the purpose of cities? And if we go way back hundreds, thousands of years, then we would say if we had a place to trade, a place of safety, with a source of clean water, we could start to create habitations that could be the formation of settlements. Nowadays, we want all sorts of things from this thing that we call cities. So we're looking for dynamic places. We're looking for places of quiet. In fact, we're looking for different things at different times. And so I could create a long list of the requirements of any individual for a city. And then if I put them all together, then we get a very large number of perspectives of what a city ought to be. And it is a complex system of systems. And then if I'm, as a civil engineer, looking to support that complex system of systems, then there's all sorts of things I need to do. One of the most important, of course, is facilitating movement. That's movement of people, resources, goods, ideas. We need infrastructure systems. And of course, those infrastructure systems must be designed to be sustainable, resilient, livable, smart, adaptable. All of those things come into the design brief. And of course, once I start talking about criteria, then I need to define what I mean. And many of these will be common to you, and I won't go into them in detail. Clearly, you could look at the presentation at your leisure. A couple of points. Livability is very much putting people at the heart of what we are developing. And in order to do that, we need to engage with them and engage them in the process of co-creation. The other point I want to raise around resilience, it's not shocks to the system that I'm looking at, but change. And that change could be gradual. So no matter what the rate, resilience is something that responds to changes in context. And then smart is, well, in my version, smart is only truly smart if it delivers on all of the above. It isn't just simply technologically enabled, swifter, cheaper ways of doing things. And then, of course, we need to talk about infrastructure. So I've taken this as an example, and this came from a particular document, looking at economic infrastructures, which are the classic ones that engineers engage with, all of this idea of transport, energy, waste, water, telecommunications. And sitting alongside those, we have the social infrastructures, which again, we all know and love, the health system, the education system, sport and leisure, security, administration. But what I thought was really interesting about this is, well, where does housing sit in this? And in fact, is housing part of the economic infrastructure? Well, I think what we have to do is consider this as broadly as we can. understanding also how those infrastructures are linked, and those dependencies and interdependencies, and there are many of them, need to be accounted for. And maybe the best way of thinking about movement is in terms of the urban metabolism, how everything moves through that system. And what we're looking for is synergistic movement. And so that if we're traveling by vehicles, then we don't get in the way of other movement of things or resources or whatever. And we don't then look at digging up our roads to get to our buried infrastructure, because that will disturb the traveling public and so on and so on. And maybe again, a good way of looking at this is how we support people across a continuum, from their homes, through streets, through neighborhoods, through urban landscapes more generally. It's a spectrum that we're looking at, and it all needs to join up. So UCRIC, in a word, joined upness in terms of its approach. We've looked at 4 missions, and again, I won't go into them in detail. The first one is about a changing world, and so the changing context, and we know what many of those changes are. Climate change, demographics, as well as population change. There are all sorts of changes, and some of them are technological. We have a mission around one planet living, acknowledging that we've only got one planet. We need to protect it, and we need to use its resources wisely without borrowing from future generations. We have a crucial one, I think, on ownership, governance, and business models, because that's often lost when we start talking of these systems. And then the last one, and the one that I happen to be leading, is on infrastructure and urban systems as drivers of equity, inclusion, and social justice. Not necessarily what a civil engineer traditionally would be looking to deliver consciously, but undoubtedly what a civil engineer would always be doing subconsciously. It sort of sits behind what we do. So I want to talk through now a system of methodologies that we have been creating over the last 20 years as a result of our research. And it's all around how we make or enable beneficial change to happen. And so I reckon there are 4 simple stages. The first is we need to compile a rigorous evidence base on which we can found our activities. Then we need to make the case for change, and that case has to be comprehensive, accessible, and crucially, it has to be transparent. But even if we have a compelling case for change, that's not enough to bring about change, because what we then need to do is create the alternative business models that would support the investment to implement the change. And these, by business models, what I'm really looking at is all of the positive outcomes of a system intervention weighed against all the negative outcomes of a system intervention. And one of those negative outcomes might be that we need to put finance in. But even then, that's not enough to bring about change, because the last part is bringing into alignment all of the forms of governance to enable the business models to work. And by this, I mean, well, the formal systems of governance. So legislation, regulation, taxation and incentives together, codes and standards, all of those formal levers of governance. But crucially, also the informal systems of governance, the individual and societal attitudes and behaviors, societal norms, practice norms, social acceptability. Essentially, what I'm looking at with all of this is the avoidance of risk. Avoidance that what we'll do is, as engineers, we will create something and then pass it over to the users to use in the hope that they will do it. So I also now want to draw on some work that I've done in the past around understanding what it is we should be doing. So I led something called a policy commission on future urban living, where we took evidence from a wide range of different individuals and organizations, nationally and internationally, on what the future held for urban living. And this report then essentially informed us of the wants and the needs, or if you like, the collective aspirations of a whole bunch of different people. So that informed us as to what we should be doing in terms of research, in terms of development, and so on. I also sat on what is known as the UK government Foresight Future of Cities project. The government has a number of foresight programs looking to inform government of action now in relation to issues of the far future. In terms of cities, we took 2 horizons, 25 years hence, 50 years hence. And we did a whole raft of different activities that I'd listed on the screen. But essentially what we were doing was crystallizing the UK's future wants and needs, the collective aspirations for the UK. And one of our, in fact, the core mantra was that when you start looking at city systems, the urban systems, they are all interdependent to some degree. If you intervene in one system, the others are likely to be impacted either to a greater or lesser degree. It's very rare that you have systems operating in isolation. Okay, so with that as a background, I was also asked to talk about what has happened in terms of COVID and the COVID challenges to the UK, but there are also then opportunities. So the first point, I think, is that we reckon that COVID has been an accelerator of change, but not usually the initiator of change. These things, many of these things would have happened. It's just we've accelerated them. And so we see all sorts of things in the UK. There is a preference for remote working for those who can. And remote working, yes, less commuting, flexible timekeeping, home working or hybrid working means that there is also an issue around the places we work, refurbishment of the home or changes to the home, utility service needs in different places. There's a preference for cleaner and quieter environments, and then getting out to blue and green space became valued. And so access to blue and green space then became a priority. Greening the public realm. There are placemaking opportunities. Retail becoming more about experience than, in fact, getting hold of stuff. So we're now looking at reinventing the high streets. So what is the future of urban centres? Is this just another reshaping? I mean, we had reshaping when we moved from the horse and cart through to the canal, through to the railways, through to the roads. Is this another form of reshaping of our city centres, urban centres, or whatever? Radical changes in mobility. We've seen a lot more active travel, partly because we were allowed to go out for exercise, and people then valued that. There's enormous interest in micro mobility. This idea of electric bikes or e-bikes, scooters, as alongside walking and cycling. We're seeing drone and robot delivery of online purchases, different forms of retail, of course. People are positively minded towards electric cars. We've got low traffic neighborhoods. We talk about the 15-minute neighborhood. And to some, there is an aversion to public transport. And only this week, we had the majority of UK adults surveyed would not wish to travel by public transport unless masks were mandated. And we're now talking about a lockdown or ease of lockdown or whatever in different places. So what will stay? There are obviously many technological and organizational changes. Many of those will stay. There's a big move towards the green economy for different reasons. And interestingly, land use planning, they're talking of a digital upgrade of the planning system, which has been mooted for a long time. Maybe that is now something that could come through very quickly, moving away from the physical to the digital. Single commercial use classes, so that changes of use of a building or a property could be enabled far more effectively. So this then leads to all sorts of interesting concepts that those in urban professions need to consider. This idea of work is what you do, not where you do it, came up 5 years ago or more in my UK government activity on the Foresight Future of Cities project. But now, of course, it's come to life. We can ask, what is the value of a journey? What is the value of going slowly? All our transport models are about time and cost. but what is the value of journey? Do we value things differently now? And if we're talking about access to green space, what is the daily dosage of green that I need? And we're talking about green prescribing for health and well-being. So maybe we now need to think about our daily dosage. And in fact, could that be given by interconnected green corridors for active travel? So am I then looking after my health and well-being in all sorts of different ways by traveling differently through the city to the centre? Or in fact, are we now talking of a city centre or many centres? Are we now talking about a different type of city with those places within 15 minutes of walking and cycling becoming effectively different types of centres? Going on to the government website, and if you were to ask the government what it was doing, it would give you this list of current priorities. So there's one around health and well-being, of course, because of the COVID situation. Then we have Build Back Better, which is an economic recovery. Build Back Fairer, which is our levelling up agenda across the country, moving from the well-endowed London and the southeast through to the less well-endowed other areas of the country. We've got Building Back Safer, which is around national security, Building Back Stronger, which is promoting our global interests, Building Back Greener, which is the government's agenda towards moving towards net zero. And I'm sure these will be evident in any country worldwide. And we have, in fact, our own response to COVID, and here is our document which can be downloaded. So I go back to this four-stage process, but I will emphasize this idea of informal governance, putting the people at the heart. I'll also emphasize reflection, iteration, to meet the collective aspirations of all. And that is where this then becomes really important if we're going to be talking about a way of doing things. So the last point I want to talk about is an engineering cities methodology. First of all, we have to define the problem, and I've listed out 5 different areas of that. The first is bringing all of the disciplines together, all of the stakeholders, and defining the collective aspirations of all, because then we know that what we're doing is going to be needed, wanted, and appropriate. Obviously, we need to do the full diagnosis thing fully. System mapping becomes really important in this because we need to establish the dependencies and interdependencies before we even do the engineering bit, the application of ingenuity. The root of the word engineer is ingenuity. That's what we do. We solve problems. But once we've gone through that process of problem solving, we then need to understand the impact today. And there are various methods of doing that. So if we put it into place today, would it work? Would it deliver all of its intended benefits? Meet all of those aspirations? And then if we put it in place and looked into the far future, is it likely to continue to deliver, or should we be doing something different? So we need a futures analysis. And only then can we make the complete and compelling case for change. And this is an example of a system map that I created for a project that I worked with one of my students on green corridors, looking at how a system intervention as a green corridor might impact on all of the other systems. You're not meant to read it, but you're meant to realize that there are very many points of dependency and interdependency that we need to consider, because those are the points at which value might be gained. And if value arises from it, you can build those into a business model. If negative value arises from it, then it also gets it built into the business model on the negative outcomes. So what we then would do is look at developing a suite of alternative business models. And as I say, this is all about articulating the positive outcomes and the negative outcomes, all of them. And then we can iterate the designs to enhance the positive and reduce or remove the negative. Then we need to go through all of those dimensions of governance that I mentioned before, and then influence policy, practice, and the public. But of course, if we're meeting the citizens' aspirations as part of this process, we will address many of the informal systems of governance and be assured that it would be welcomed by the citizens. And of course, if we co-create the solutions with the citizenry, then we will inevitably get citizen buy-in. And again, we'll address those informal forms of governance. And then we need to get the message out. And this is one way of getting the message out. We've created, as part of my research, a series of little books written in accessible language to explain our thinking. And these are quite seriously little books. They're A5 publications, but written in accessible language. So that's essentially how I would go about things. This is a description of the UCRIC facilities and programs. You can find obviously more on the website, and I've left one of my papers as a link at the bottom, which explains this in more detail. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that presentation. It was really great to have your insight. It was very interesting to us to hear about UCRIC and also about urban policy and how it's being informed by evidence in the UK. We've just got a few questions now that we'd like to put to you. And the first one is about smart cities and places. You gave a particular definition of smart cities in your talk. I just wonder if you could tell us a bit more about what such a city would look like and how it would be experienced by the people that live there.
Yeah, so within the scope of cities and future cities, we have all sorts of terms that are bandied around, and smart is one of those. And as I alluded to, I think smart is only truly smart if it takes us where we need to go. So what I would hope is that cities of the future are places where people feel that they can live their lives in the way that they want to, most effectively, taking due regard for all of the essential elements, which is living within our planetary boundaries, for which we then need to think very carefully about resources and how we use them, taking the courteous approach to how people then interact, both with their environment, built and natural, and within each other. And of course, what COVID has done is thrown in all sorts of well, issues and terms, one of which is physically distancing rather than socially distancing in my language. And we talk about social distancing, but we shouldn't be socially distanced. We should be socially connected, but physically distanced. And so there are all sorts of subtleties. And of course, then it comes back to, well, what do we want from cities? And again, I put up a slide on that. But I do think that access to nature within cities is important. I visited Sydney and had access to nature then when I was there. If you go into any big city, there is nature to be accessed only if we allow it. And so I think that would become an important element of the future. So we can touch back to all of the pillars of sustainability, if you wish, in how we look for cities to operate.
I was very interested in the Foresight project that you spoke of. I think Foresight's quite an interesting methodology for investigating cities and future scenarios and as a planning tool. I'm interested if you can tell us a little bit more about, through that Foresight research project, what kinds of cities people were envisaging for the future in the UK. What were some of the issues that came up and were raised by people through those processes?
Yes, this is really interesting, isn't it? So I think people were assuming, for example, that all of the infrastructure systems that support them would continue to support them effectively. And of course, what we have to do is to understand the current context, the current landscape, before we even project in the future. And of course, the current context is one where we have a somewhat overstretched set of systems, including our infrastructure systems, and they're aging. As we are, but they are, and they've been around a long time. And so what we currently think of is, well, we're going to move into the future. We'll do all sorts of new things, and that will be supported by all sorts of new systems. Except that they won't, because a lot of what we've got needs to continue into the future. So I think the aspirational futures of people and communities can be accommodated, but they need to be seamlessly woven into our existing structures, particularly the infrastructures and the existing systems. And so it's a rather long way of saying I think we can rethink, repurpose, maintain our existing systems to meet the aspirations of people and communities, but it needs to be done with, again, all of the likely consequences articulated and then accounted for. And of course, contextual change comes into that in a big way. And we have seen this around the world. We have seen extremes of climate, and of course you can see it almost daily in the international press. We know that we've got an aging population in general in the Western world, or the more developed world. We also know that we've got a greater population. We've got a limit on the resources we can use. So circularity and the circular economy comes into play. We have to rethink our perceptions of what is consumed and what is wasted. All of those things come together. And so it's the joined-uppedness, and the approach that UCRIC is taking is looking at how we do that complete joined-uppedness to get to where we need to go.
Thank you. Taking that theme of continuity and change that you've touched on there, and also talking about it in terms of COVID-19, I think you were saying that COVID has accelerated change in cities and highlighted that many of these changes were, in a way, already happening. They've just been sped up through the implications of the pandemic. What do you think had prevented those changes taking place? What had been holding them back beforehand, do you think?
Well, there's the natural conservatism within our both our decision makers and with our systems, because well, we've always done things in this sort of way, and change can be a challenge, and unless it's forced. And so there are all sorts of perceptions, and I'll take an example of the 4-day week, totally randomly into this. And so would you say to employers, why don't you reduce the number of hours you expect from your employees, and then you will get better productivity? Well, that would never work, because traditionally what we've wanted is a 6-day week, and we try to fit fit that 6-day week into 5 days. And of course, the counterintuitive thing is that for some companies, the evidence has been that if you reduce the amount of contracted time, you get better productivity. Now, I'm not going to enter into that debate, but what I do want to do is to think, well, change can create very positive outcomes, and I think the fear of change is the unintended or unanticipated consequences. And I keep coming back to this. If we can understand our systems well enough and then de-risk the change, not just the investment, but the change, and demonstrate that there could be advantages, what we should then do is try things. And so I'm all for national government, local government experimenting to explore whether change can be put into place without the risks and with a full understanding of all of the potential benefits. And I think if you put those balance the benefits and the risks thing through that transparent systemic approach to life, then you might find that we can move to better places. And I don't think we have been in a position to do that articulation, either of the benefits, the complete suite of benefits, or the risks. And I think we're now in a position where we could do that, and that will unlock the inherent unwillingness to change because of it's risky.
So you're confident that moving out of the pandemic, and as cities, I guess, adjust and recover, that that we will see some of that that type of change that you're talking about?
I think so. Yes. I mean, the pandemic has thrown a shock to our system and all of our systems. And of course, what we want to do is to learn from how we've responded to that, so that we can improve the way we've done things in the past. I am the eternal optimist. I think you probably have to be to research in the areas that I've been researching. And but I do see that there are all sorts of good things that can come from what has been a very bad situation for very many people and communities and so on. And so it's tested our system for resilience. So I think then resilience becomes a really important concept in the way we move forward, because we shouldn't be just resilient to a pandemic and those sorts of changes, but we have to be resilient to all of the other contextual changes that are going on about us. And so if it brings to the fore the need to take resilience into account and effectively value it in our business models. So if I take a business model for a piece of infrastructure, I can then look at a pound note or a dollar investment and a pound note or dollar return on that investment. But how do I value within that space sustainability and resilience and livability? Is the question. And I think we are now valuing those things in a different way because of the shock to the system. So if they get built into our plans and our activities and our investments, then we'll be in a better place.
Just wonder, continuing that line of thought, if you can perhaps provide some examples. And you did list the headline policies that the UK government has coming out of the pandemic, and one of those was building back greener, I think. Would you be able to maybe provide some, some more concrete examples of the kinds of policy shifts or the kinds of initiatives that are happening under say that particular headline, building back greener, just so we get a bit of a flavour of what some of those changed approaches actually look like on the ground?
Yes, I'll throw the uncertainty thing in because in the UK, at least, I think globally, those with the purse strings are nervous, and so there's a Treasury issue here. But I think one of the ways in which we have changed has been around the way we move and the reasons for moving. And in fact, there's an independent transport commission in the UK that has just published a book saying why should we travel effectively? There are benefits to traveling, then we might be in danger of losing those. However, we've changed our travel patterns. So a positive way to build back greener, look at how we enable active travel. Look at for example, the creation from our existing landscape of green infrastructure corridors that would allow active travel. And so that's an area that I've been looking at in many ways. But what we've seen is certain towns, cities putting in low traffic neighborhoods. What I've seen from my own research is that if you were to put in place green infrastructure corridors, you would deliver on many of the environmental benefits and also the social benefits, and intriguingly, also many of the economic benefits that cities and their citizens aspire to. And so what I could see is a change of landscape to allow people to work more flexibly when they can, to access facilities without the use of the privately owned motor car, then clogging up our arteries. And that will lead to a better quality of life. And because I think we will rethink our travel to the value of the journey, not the inconvenience of the journey to get to where we want to do whatever it is we want to do. So I can see those things changing, and that then raises the issue of, well, what are cities for? What are city centres for? What are urban centres for? and should they be repurposed? And I think all of that is happening. I mean, we talk about retail becoming an experience more than a need to go and get something and take it home. And so I can see all of our systems changing now far more rapidly to move to that sort of place. And so I think our landscapes will change. And I think our perception of homes will change too, for that matter.
Chris, just thank you so much for your time and your input to our conference today. We really, really appreciate that. And there's a lot that you've raised here that I think will be explored further in some of the other sessions throughout the day. So we really do appreciate your keynote and your time. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. Just a quick change and a reorganisation of my decor, but welcome back. And look, I hope you enjoyed that presentation from Professor Chris Rogers from UCRIC. UCRIC is one of several international organisations that at Uhuru we've been looking at to help inform the development of our own urban policy research and the urban policy research agenda. Well, that brings to an end the morning sessions from the conference today, and we're about to break for lunch. So I do invite you now to get ready to log off and go and have something to eat and stretch your legs. And we'll resume again in our next session at 1:30 p.m. So when you come back, log in again. You just need to go back to the timeline and through there come into our next session. But I look forward to seeing you again after a short break. Thanks.